Hi everyone. As Katarina says, I work for a project called Mistra Eviem, which I'll talk to you about in a second. And we're based at the moment at the Stockholm Environment Institute. And what I wanted to talk to you today about is how we deal with all of this information, in particular scientific information, when we want to help people make decisions about agriculture. And so before I go on, I just wanted to put up a few acknowledgements. I think our presentations are going to be made available, so this is hopefully a useful slide. But along with Eviem and SEI, my organizations, we have the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, which is an organization that's not for profit. It's established to help promote good evidence synthesis. And they have a journal, Environmental Evidence, centers all over the world, one of which is in Johannesburg, which I've worked with fairly closely. There's the Eclipse project, and we're going to hear from Zoe later on today. I've been involved a little bit with that. The Global Evidence Synthesis Initiative, which aims to help low and middle income countries develop the capacity to synthesize evidence in a reliable way. Conservation evidence, which many of you may be familiar with, spearheaded by Bill Sutherland in Cambridge, which also aim to summarize evidence in a slightly different way. I've also worked a bit with DEFRA, who are very keen on trying to ensure that they have reliable evidence synthesis within short policy timescales. And then these other organizations that do a similar thing to what we do within environment, but in the field of social welfare and crime and justice and education, in health and in international development. So these are the kind of organizations that are on in this landscape of synthesizing evidence. It's a very large community, and it's starting to be a more connected community. So what do I mean by evidence synthesis? Why do we need to synthesize evidence? Firstly, I wanted to have a caveat that I'm talking about evidence, and by that I mean documented scientific evidence, rather than knowledge. Knowledge synthesis is a larger subject area and includes tacit knowledge and knowledge that's held in practitioners' heads. So I'm focusing really on the research evidence, the stuff that we're probably most familiar with as scientists. And the reason that we summarize evidence, there are several. One is that when we want to make a decision and base that decision on good evidence, often it's not enough to focus on a single study. That study might be in a context that doesn't exactly map our own context for the decision making, but it might be just a little bit too specific. And it might be that it's not as reliable as the evidence base as a whole. Connected to that, we're facing an increasingly expanding body of evidence. Whenever you look at the number of articles that's been published since the 1970s, you'll see an exponential curve. We're dealing with more and more evidence on a daily basis. We also have a need for certainty or for accuracy when we're making decisions. We want to make a decision based on the most accurate evidence. And for that, we need to look at a large number of studies. We might also be interested in how context affects a result. We might not be interested so much in what the impact of a specific practice is, but more interested in how context affects it. How does soil type affect the impact of tillage on soil organic carbon, for example? And by looking at single studies, you only have perhaps one or a small range of those contexts. By looking at a whole evidence base, you can look at a wide range of contexts and start to see how that context influences the impact or effectiveness of a particular practice or driver. We also, in decision-making, are often faced with a need for transparency and accountability, which is a good thing, but it often means that the way that we summarize evidence traditionally, with traditional literature reviews, as I'll come on to, isn't really enough. If we pick a few studies that we're familiar with, we might introduce a bias there. So we need to be transparent about how we got our evidence and how we summarize that evidence to come to advice for decision making. And then related to that as well, there's a whole suite of biases and sources of subjectivity when we try to bring items of evidence together for decision making. So there's a need there to synthesize evidence and to do it reliably. And that's where literature reviews and meta-analyses, which you're probably all familiar with, come from. But I wanted to take a few minutes just to highlight why the way that we traditionally review evidence is essentially wrong. A little bit controversial there. But if we imagine a hypothetical evidence base, this is the landscape that we could go to get all of our evidence. If we're dealing with soil, organic carbon, and tillage, let's say, it's every article ever published on the impact of tillage on soil organic carbon. That's our hypothetical evidence base. With a traditional review, at the worst end of the scale, we might have a review where someone just selects studies that are relevant to them. They know of them, they don't need to go anywhere to find them, they've got them printed out on their shelf, they just do a review of them. And that's opening our review up to selection bias. We might know of them because they agree with a certain school of thought. We might have them on our shelf because we think they're particularly good, or they agree with our own opinion. If we then go one step towards being systematic and try to search for evidence, we might just search in one database. But that database might not be representative of the evidence base as a whole. We might miss large portions of the evidence base that could be important in understanding how the evidence looks as a whole. In a traditional review, we rarely look for grey literature. We quite often see in traditional reviews that we only focused on the peer-reviewed literature. But there's often really valuable evidence hidden in that grey literature, organizational reports, government reports, things that potentially could have gone through very stringent peer review. And so we open ourselves up to publication bias by not looking for them, where positive and significant results are more likely to be published in academic journals because they're interesting, they're sexy. Typically in traditional reviews, there is a total lack of transparency. We don't have methods sections in traditional literature reviews, but they have somehow sourced evidence. So they are themselves performing a kind of desk experiment. And so it's Science 101. We need to know what methods they used, but we traditionally don't report that. Another issue is that even if they do report their methods, they look systematically, what the authors might do is tally up the number of positive studies and the number of negative studies, and if they find more positive studies, they say that's evidence of a particular impact being positive. But that ignores the magnitude of those studies, and it ignores the fact that some of those studies might not be reliable. Often because of publication bias, the more significant, the more positive studies are actually the least reliable. And then finally, it's very easy within a traditional review to focus on a few studies in our discussion because they're easy to explain. They perhaps agree with our school of thought, and that's called discussion bias. And so systematic reviews, which were developed in the field of medicine in the 1980s, were developed to deal with this rapidly expanding body of evidence, and they're now routinely used to summarize evidence, and typically regarded as gold standards. The methods were translated into conservation biology in 2006 and then expanded through the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence into environmental science more broadly. And they're widely used in a range of other disciplines. And the idea is that you approach a systematic review using systematic methods. You approach a review using systematic methods to try to account for these limitations and biases. And so we're back to our hypothetical evidence base. How do systematic reviews deal with these problems? Well, firstly, we try to be exhaustive in searching. So we try to look for all the potentially relevant evidence that we can. The square doesn't entirely overlap because we know that sometimes it's impossible to find all of the evidence because of resource constraints and because some evidence is very difficult to source. But we try. We also try to be comprehensive. So when we search across multiple databases. There's an obvious overlap there, but it's easy to remove those duplicates in the search results. We do that because databases vary in the scope, in terms of their geography, in the time ranges, in the terms of the evidence that they have within them. We then also look for grey literature. So we specifically target organizational websites. We target stakeholders. We search across search engines looking for grey literature that might help to counteract publication bias. We also look for grey literature that is academic studies that weren't published because they weren't positive or they weren't interesting or they weren't significant. Throughout a systematic review, we document the methods that we use transparently in minute detail so that the whole process of the review is repeatable. And then we weight studies. This can either be done in a meta-analysis, for example, or in a qualitative synthesis as well. We give more weight to studies that are inherently more reliable. And then we synthesize everything. We don't just focus on a few studies for the discussion. And from a procedural perspective, this is what that systematic review process looks like. We start off with formulating our question so that it's posed in a way that is answerable with a systematic review. Within Eviem, we have heavy stakeholder engagement there so that the people who are going to be using the evidence at the end help to structure the scope of the evidence and the methods that we'll use. We then publish a protocol which outlines the planned methods. That's peer-reviewed so that subject experts and methodology experts help to make the methods as reliable as possible. And then we go through a searching and screening process where we search across a wide range of different databases and screen articles according to the title, the abstract, and then the full text in a stepwise way. We extract data and descriptive information. And then importantly, within a review, we critically appraise all of the evidence. Some evidence is not reliable. Some evidence published in academic journals is not reliable. And some grey literature as well is not so reliable. And that critical appraisal step essentially allows us to do a peer review on all of the evidence and only include the evidence that is reliable enough. We then synthesize the evidence that we find to get an overall picture, and then publish a final review that's peer-reviewed and published in an academic journal, and then an important communication step as well. And throughout this process, transparency, repeatability, and objectivity are the key tenets that we try to maximize. This is where systematic reviews sit in the policy cycle. This is from Lynn Dick's paper. And so we start off with experience that gets published in primary studies. We collate those primary studies in a systematic review. More commonly within health, they have summaries of systematic reviews where they have multiple systematic reviews on the same topic. We're not quite there yet in the environment. But then those summaries help to produce decision support systems which allow the production of advice or guidance to help structure decision-making. And where single studies are taken alone to help create decision support systems, that's a selective understanding bias, where it might be appropriate for single studies in a resource-constrained or an evidence-constrained environment to structure decision support systems. But the likelihood is that there's a much larger evidence base that really should be summarized to help produce systems that then produce advice and guidance. So systematic reviews involve a full synthesis of study findings. They hold a lens to the findings of individual studies. So they look through studies and want to know what the impact of a particular intervention, or how effective an intervention is, or the impact of a particular driver in the environment. They can involve a quantitative synthesis like meta-analysis, or a qualitative synthesis like a framework synthesis or a thematic synthesis. And the answers to a systematic review are things like yes, no, positive, negative, by how much, and how much uncertainty is there, and which are the influential drivers that help to affect that relationship. For anyone who's seen a meta-analysis within a systematic review, you might be familiar with this kind of forest plot, where you have the results of individual studies showing the overall effect of a particular intervention, let's say a particular farming practice, and that we have some uncertainty about that within the study. And the size of the square indicates the weight, how much reliability we can have in that individual study. And then combined, those three studies produce a summary effect which has a mean overall effect estimate and a degree of uncertainty. So we can tell from a systematic review, sometimes hopefully, particularly if we do meta-analysis, what the overall effect is likely to be given a range of uncertainty. Systematic maps are a methodology that was developed within the social sciences about 10 to 15 years ago, and is now becoming much more popular across other disciplines, particularly in environment. And the idea with a systematic map is that you don't carry out a full synthesis. You're not so interested in the study findings yet. What you're really asking is what evidence exists on a particular topic. What does the evidence look like on a particular topic? And there we find clusters of evidence, bodies of subtopics where there is enough evidence to do a meta-analysis or a qualitative synthesis perhaps. Importantly, also where there are evidence gaps, so where we might have a policy that is based on a lack of evidence and there's a clear need for primary research to help fill that gap. We can also find patterns in methodology. How are people investigating this topic, and what methods are they using, and how reliable are they? And that's what we call a narrative synthesis. There's a narrative description of the evidence base. This is one potential output of a systematic map. It's called an evidence atlas. It's for a review that I'll talk about in a second. And there we can structure all of the evidence and put it in a cartographic map so that the user can see where across the globe the evidence came from, and then see lots of descriptive information about every study. And from that, if they want to, they can select a subgroup of studies and take that forward to meta-analysis, or they can look to see where are there evidence gaps, or there are areas where we thought there was evidence and actually there isn't. And so moving on to agriculture now, there are key, what I call synthesis gaps, where there is primary evidence, but getting that into decision-making requires a step in the middle to synthesize that evidence. There's a lot of evidence, particularly in agriculture, but getting that through to policy requires some form of synthesis, and often there is a gap in synthesizing that to be used in a meaningful way. And that's where Eviem comes in. That's why we were established. In 2012, we were initially a 5-year project, but we've extended on for 6.5, looking at synthesizing evidence on environmental issues. And because we're funded by a Swedish research funder, our topics all have to be relevant to Sweden, but we generally have broad geographical scopes that go beyond Sweden to make the most of relevant evidence. So quite often we have Boreal temperate climate zones, but sometimes global as well. We have a total now of 18 review projects extending across agriculture, forestry, marine and freshwater systems, also public health and toxicology, amongst others. We have a secretariat of 7 staff and an executive committee, of whom we have one esteemed member in the audience. And all of these 18 review projects have international review teams. We have groups of between 3 and 5 or 6 international experts who are leaders in their subject, who help to plan the review and help to conduct parts of the review project. But they're led by the members of the secretariat. So just to give you a few examples now, we have one systematic map that was published late in 2015, and this topic was asking a question: what evidence exists on the impact of farming on soil organic carbon? And this was initiated back in 2013, I think, and we searched across a large number of databases, around 15. We found over 24,000 search results, which were read individually. That yielded almost 6,000 relevant titles and almost 2,000 relevant abstracts at the next stage. And the final systematic map database had 735 studies across a range of different management practices, including soil amendments, crop rotation, different fertilizers and fertilizer amounts, and different intensities of tillage. And this is the project that resulted in that interactive evidence atlas. So this was a large database of descriptive information about 735 studies. It highlighted evidence gaps, and it also highlighted clusters, and some of those clusters have gone on to form full systematic reviews. And this is a systematic review that is in press at the moment. It's looking at the impact of reduced tillage on soil organic carbon. So from that 735 study systematic map, we took the bulk of studies and performed a search update, and we ended up with 351 studies that went into meta-analyses. These are the 2 summary figures that sum up most of what we found in the review. Behind each of these diamonds, there are up to around 100 studies in each meta-analysis, so there's a lot of information behind this. But we found 2 bodies of evidence, one looking at soil organic carbon concentration and one looking at stock. And within concentration, we looked at 3 different soil levels, 0 to 15 centimeters, 15 to 30, and then below 30. And we found 3 levels of tillage. There was no tillage, which is quite obvious. Then there's high intensity tillage, which is full inversion, where you turn the soil over down to a depth of about 30 centimeters. And then intermediate tillage, where the soil isn't turned over, it's just disked or chiseled, normally down to a shallower depth. So there's a spectrum of different intensities of how much the soil is turned over or disturbed. And we compared no tillage with high tillage, no tillage with intermediate, and intermediate with high. And these diamonds show, if they sit to the right, that there's an accumulation or an improvement in the amount of soil organic carbon concentration in the soil, with no-till versus high-till. So when we look at shallow levels, we have an increase in carbon in no-till relative to high-till. But at deeper depths, we don't see that relationship. It overlaps the line of no effect. So we have a similar relationship for no-till versus intermediate tillage. And then the same relationship for intermediate versus high at shallow, but a loss of soil carbon in a middle depth for intermediate versus high. And we find for soil organic carbon stock, in the upper layer, we also see an improvement, an increase in soil organic carbon stock for no-till versus high and no-till versus intermediate, but not for intermediate versus high-till. So this information is all to show that in the surface layer of the soil, a reduction in tillage intensity can improve the amount of soil carbon there, but it's not getting deep down. So we need to, as Tim said, there is no single practice that can improve food the sustainability. It's a suite of practices, and we're likely to need a suite of practices within farming to improve the carbon in the soil. Tillage alone can't do that. But in the surface soil, it can in terms of concentration. And so this study was the systematic review of the impacts of reduced tillage on soil organic carbon that came from the systematic map I introduced. We also have a couple of other systematic reviews, one looking at long-term evidence across a suite of farming practices, and one looking at the impact of crop rotation. Those two reviews are ongoing. And then moving away from soil organic carbon, we have a couple of other projects on agricultural topics, one looking at the impacts of buffer strips on social ecological systems, and one looking at the impacts of neonicotinoids on non-target organisms. So we have a suite of evidence synthesis products within Eviem that will be tackling agricultural evidence. So to summarize, hopefully I've shown that there's a need for reliable reviews in agriculture, and that traditional reviews, while they're filling a certain need, they have a low level of reliability, so we need to be more systematic about it. And that there are methods that were developed in other disciplines and have been tried and tested that are gold standard. They're widely accepted as being reliable. And that there's a danger basing decisions on traditional literature reviews because of the bias inherent in them. And I've given you an introduction to some of the projects that we're doing. We're finishing up towards the end of this year and May next year, so the projects that aren't finished so far will be finished in the next few months. But as Eviem comes to a close, the Swedish science funder, Formas, is starting to recognize the need for evidence synthesis, and they're going to be taking over some of that role. But there's a wide need for evidence synthesis, particularly with rotating science policies like the Common Agricultural Policy, where we can have a 7-year lead-in time to the next round of changes or revisions to CAP, that there is an opportunity for much more reliable evidence synthesis to provide exactly the kind of reliable, transparent evidence that's needed for this kind of decision making. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Neal. So some short questions for Neal now, and
I have just a quick one. Has anyone done compares the results from a traditional bad review and a systemic wonderful review to show that they are qualitatively or quantitatively different?
I don't think there has, even in healthcare. I think one of the dangers with that would be that you might find the same result, but that's not evidence that a systematic review isn't necessary. So it's not just about the result, it's about the process, and the transparency and the accountability and the verifiability of a systematic review is so high that it's much more reliable. So if a decision is based on a systematic review, you can then go back and understand why that decision might not have been right, why context perhaps wasn't quite right. With a traditional review, you just can't. You have to take what they did as read. So no one has, but I think there have been suggestions within the community that we do that to try and improve the merit of systematic reviews, but I think there's a danger inherent in that.
Of course, I sympathize with what you said here, being part of Eviem. But my question is rather about the cost and feasibility of actually using systematic reviews in environmental policy. In medicine, I think that conditions are to some extent more homogeneous than they are for environmental problems. Furthermore, in medicine, the endeavor of making systematic reviews is also comparatively well funded because there's large private interest at stake also. So, do you think it's realistic in a medium term to actually achieve enough systematic reviews that it can be a fundamental part of decision making, or do we need to rely on various shortcuts in the intermediate term, and if so, how do we do that in a good way?
Yeah, that's a good question. Within healthcare, the system, the policy system is different, but also the evidence system is different as well. So the evidence is much easier to find because they have a much better way of cataloguing evidence. Within a systematic review in medicine, you're talking maybe 5,000 to 8,000 search results instead of the 25,000, sometimes 35,000 that we deal with. So they're inherently different, and because of that, there is a slightly different approach to how you conduct the review in a cost-efficient way. I don't necessarily think that the funding is particularly different. There are some areas of environmental policy where funding is enough to fund systematic reviews. The GRACE project, which was established to do systematic reviews in the field of genetic modified organisms, conducted, I think, around 9 systematic reviews in a Horizon 2020 or an FP7 project. So there is a recognition of what systematic reviews are and that they can be cost effective. But within certain areas, particularly conservation, the research funding is limited and you can't do a systematic review all the time. So I think while we recognize that systematic reviews are the gold standard, being pragmatic, there are some cases where you need to have evidence for a decision and you don't have the time for a systematic review. And I think in those cases, there are always things that you can do to improve a review and make it more systematic without having to go all the way towards a systematic review. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is traditional literature reviews and reviews that claim to be systematic that are missing vital steps and that are unreliable. And if they'd planned their review in a slightly different way, maybe had a little bit more investment in slightly different processes and procedures within the review, they could have made it much more systematic still without being a full systematic review, but they've hit the wrong practices. And so along with pushing evidence synthesis and systematic reviews as a gold standard method, within SEI we are trying to improve practices of both our colleagues and externally, just trying to be a bit more systematic. One example of that is transparency. So if you do search within a couple of databases, you have a search string that you put in the databases, you know when it was, you know what the options were, you know how many search results, but often, even with a review that claims to be systematic, you won't publish those. And so just by being more transparent and publishing all of that in an additional file, you can then be much more verifiable. You can prove that you did go to the databases. You can show what search terms you put in. Quite often, that's where you spot mistakes. And so you can have small practices that improve the reliability of your review and improve how systematic it is without having to be fully systematic. We're very lucky having a large amount of funding to be able to do 18 systematic reviews. But in those cases where you don't have those resources, you can still do a lot more than is currently being done.